Art is a hobby for the idle rich or a delusion for the poor. You are neither, Amelia. You're a liability I'm liquidating. These were the last words my father, Charles Davenport, said to me before he pushed my mother's bust off a mahogany console table, shattering $4,000 worth of Italian marble flooring and my heart in one move. My name is Amelia Harlow, and I am 32 years old. To the international art world, I am a pioneer of modern form, a woman whose sculptures are chiseled from the very essence of human resilience. But to the man sitting at table 1 in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel tonight, I am nothing more than the daughter who starved 15 years ago. My father, Charles, the CEO of Davenport Holdings, sits there in a custom-tailored charcoal Brioni suit that costs more than my first 3 years of rent in a Brooklyn basement. He is sipping a vintage Macallan, looking every bit the king of Manhattan real estate, unaware that the invisible threads of his empire are about to be cut. Before I show you the $1.5 million hammer strike that will break him, I need you to understand how we got here. Let me take you back to a rainy Tuesday in April 2009. We were in the foyer of our Upper East Side townhouse, a property valued at $22 million. The air smelled of expensive beeswax polish and the lilies my mother used to insist on having delivered fresh every morning from a florist on Madison Avenue. I was 18, clutching a portfolio of sketches and an acceptance letter to the Rhode Island School of Design. I thought he would be proud. I thought that, for once, the man who measured human worth in quarterly earnings would see the fire in my eyes as something valuable. Instead, he looked at my sketches. Months of charcoal dust under my fingernails and sleepless nights, and he didn't even turn the pages. He just looked at me with those cold, slate-gray eyes and told me he had already redirected my tuition fund into a trust for my brother, Julian. Julian, who was currently failing his freshman year at Columbia, but had the right anatomy to carry the Davenport name. Charles told me that if I left for art school, I was leaving the family. He told me he was liquidating his investment in a defective asset. That asset was me. I walked out of that house with a backpack, my charcoal pencils, and exactly $142 in my bank account. I spent the next decade in the trenches of the New York art scene, a world that is far less glamorous than the movies suggest. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously to afford a shared studio space in a drafty warehouse in Bushwick, where the rent was $2,800 a month. I was a barista at a high-end cafe in Dumbo from 5 in the morning until noon, serving $5 lattes to people who looked exactly like my father. Then I would head to a gallery in Chelsea where I worked as an assistant for $15 an hour, sweeping floors and painting over scuff marks on white walls left by the heels of socialites. At night, from 8 until 2 in the morning, I was a cocktail waitress at a lounge where the bass from the speakers vibrated in my teeth. My hands were always cramped, either from frothing milk, scrubbing floors, or finally, in the blue light of dawn, gripping a chisel. There were nights when dinner was a single sleeve of saltine crackers and a jar of peanut butter from the corner bodega, because I had to choose between a proper meal and a 20-pound bag of casting clay. My clothes were thrifted finds from the L-Train vintage shop, and my shoes were heavy boots that I had resoled myself with industrial adhesive. I remember standing in line at the grocery store, sweating as the cashier scanned a carton of eggs and a loaf of bread, praying the transaction wouldn't be declined for a balance of $12. During those years, I didn't exist to the Davenports. My father had scrubbed my name from the social register. When the New York Times published a feature on Julian's appointment to the board of directors, they listed Charles's family as having only 1 child. I was a ghost, a liquidated liability wandering the streets of Brooklyn. But while they were attending galas at the Met and vacationing in Saint-Tropez on their 80-foot Sunseeker yacht, I was learning the language of stone and metal. I learned that marble doesn't care about your last name. It only responds to the precision of your strike and the depth of your intent. I began working under the pseudonym A. Harlow, stripping away the Davenport name like excess stone. My work started small, then grew into massive, jagged structures that looked like they were screaming. I found beauty in the cracks, in the way a broken surface catches the light. By the time I was 28, a prominent collector bought a piece for $50,000. It was the first time I felt like I could breathe without a weight on my chest. I used that money not for a fancy apartment, but for better tools, pneumatic hammers, diamond-tipped saws, and a studio with actual heating. Now, 15 years after being tossed out like trash, the irony is thick enough to choke on. We are at the annual Founders Gala, the most prestigious night in the New York philanthropic calendar. The Pierre Hotel's ballroom is a sea of black ties and silk gowns. The centerpieces are towering arrangements of white hydrangeas and gold-leafed branches, each costing more than my first year of groceries. My father is here because he needs a win. His latest development project in Hudson Yards is hemorrhaging cash due to a series of lawsuits and construction delays. He needs the optics of being a patron of the arts to secure the next round of funding from the European investors seated at his table. Tonight's centerpiece of the live auction is a sculpture titled The Liquidated Asset. It is a haunting 6-foot-tall masterpiece carved from a single block of translucent Carrara marble. It depicts a figure emerging from a shattered shell, the edges sharp and dangerous, the center soft and exquisitely human. The program lists the artist as A. Harlow, the reclusive visionary who has taken the art world by storm. Charles Davenport has no idea that A. Harlow is the daughter he hasn't spoken to since he broke her mother's bust. He has spent the last hour bragging to his associates about how he has an eye for talent and how he intends to outbid everyone for this piece to anchor the lobby of his new tower. I am standing in the shadows near the service entrance, wearing a vintage black silk gown I bought for $300 at a consignment shop. My hair pulled back tightly to hide the exhaustion that never quite leaves an artist's bones. I watch him laugh, a loud, booming sound that used to make me tremble. He looks at the sculpture with a predatory glint in his eye, seeing only a trophy, a way to prove he is still at the top of the food chain. He doesn't see the thousands of hours of physical pain etched into the stone. He doesn't see the blood from my blistered hands that stained the clay models. He doesn't see me. The auctioneer, a man with a voice like polished mahogany, takes the stage. The room goes silent as the spotlight hits the marble. The bidding starts at $500,000. My father's paddle goes up instantly. 600, 750. The numbers fly through the air like insults. At $1 million, the room gasps. Charles doesn't flinch. He is used to buying what he wants. He raises his paddle for $1.2 million. He looks around the room, a smirk playing on his lips, confident that no one will challenge the lion in his own den. But he has forgotten one thing. You cannot liquidate a person's soul and expect them not to haunt you. I have spent years preparing for this moment, not just as an artist, but as a woman who reclaimed her own value. I have been quietly buying back the debt he sold off to various shell companies during his midlife crisis. I have documented every illegal corner he cut in the 2009 townhouse renovation, the one that led to the death of his mother's marble floors, and so much more. But tonight isn't about the lawsuits. Tonight is about the hammer. The bidding reaches $1.4 million. A rival developer from Chicago raises his hand. My father's face flushes a deep, angry red. He is losing control, and control is the only thing he loves more than money. He thrusts his paddle into the air. $1.5 million, he bellows, his voice echoing off the gilded ceiling. The auctioneer pauses, looking for any other takers. Going once, going twice. Sold to Mr. Charles Davenport for $1.5 million. The room erupts in polite, wealthy applause. My father stands up, adjusting his lapels, basking in the glow of his own perceived brilliance. He walks toward the stage to claim his prize, to pose for the photographers from Vogue and the Daily Beast. He reaches the sculpture and places a hand on the marble, claiming it as his own. That is when I step out of the shadows. I walk slowly, the sound of my heels on the marble floor echoing like a countdown. The photographers turn their lenses toward me, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. As I reach the stage, I see the moment the recognition hits him. It starts in his eyes. the way they narrow as he tries to place the face. Then the color drains from his cheeks, leaving him looking older, more fragile. He looks at me, then at the name on the plaque. A. Harlow. Amelia Harlow, the liability. The asset he liquidated. I don't smile. I don't need to. I have already won. I look at him, this man who thought he could define my worth, and I realize that he is the one who is hollow. He has spent $1.5 million to buy back a piece of the daughter he tried to destroy, and the irony is that he will never truly own it. The stone belongs to me. The story belongs to me. And very soon, as the truth about his crumbling empire comes to light, the only thing he will have left is this cold, hard reminder of the girl who survived him. Family isn't a line item on a balance sheet. Family is the person who keeps carving even when the world tries to turn them into dust. And I am still carving. The Davenport estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, was never a home in the traditional sense of the word, but rather a 12,000-square-foot branding exercise constructed of cold limestone, oversized Palladian windows, and a silence so thick it felt like physical pressure against my eardrums. My father, Charles Davenport, now 61 years old, presided over that mausoleum not as a patriarch, but as a senior wealth manager whose entire existence was measured in basis points, diversified portfolios, and an endless rotation of navy and charcoal Brooks Brothers golden fleece suits that cost more than my entire annual grocery budget during my years in Brooklyn. To Charles, life was a series of transactions, a ledger where every human interaction had to yield a measurable return on investment. And unfortunately for him, I was the only entry that consistently showed up in the red. Growing up in that house felt like living inside a high-end showroom where the furniture was meant to be admired but never touched, and the air always smelled faintly of expensive citrus-based cleaning agents and the stale, metallic scent of old money that had been sitting in offshore accounts for far too long. My brother, Harrison, who is now 35, was always the golden achievement of the Davenport brand, a carbon copy of our father who walked with the same stiff-backed arrogance and wore the same expression of bored superiority as if the world owed him a debt he was simply waiting to collect. Harrison was the kind of man who would spend $14,000 on a pre-owned Rolex Submariner just to look the part during a 30-minute networking lunch at the Harvard Club, all while secretly carrying a staggering $85,000 balance on a high-interest black card that he hid from our father like a shameful disease. He was a master of the aesthetic of success, a man built entirely out of appearances and leveraged debt. Yet in my father's eyes, he was the only one worth the Davenport name because he spoke the language of the spreadsheet. They would sit in the mahogany-paneled library for hours, the amber glow of 25-year-old Macallan glistening in their crystal tumblers, discussing 401k yields, real estate cap rates, and the strategic liquidation of underperforming assets, while the world outside continued to spin on axes they refused to acknowledge. I was the glitch in their perfectly curated spreadsheet, the variable that refused to be solved or mitigated by their standard financial models. While they were upstairs calculating the future value of their inheritance, I was retreating into the damp, poorly lit basement of the estate, a space they avoided because it smelled of earth and humidity rather than leather and floor wax. Down there, surrounded by $12 blocks of gray WED clay and the rhythmic ticking of a cheap plastic clock, I found the only reality that made sense to me. I would spend entire weekends with gray grit under my fingernails and dried slip streaking my forearms, my hands raw from the constant friction of shaping form out of nothingness. They saw my obsession as a failure of character, a messy and unprofitable hobby that stained the pristine reputation they worked so hard to maintain. But I saw a future they simply didn't have the imagination to calculate. To them, the clay was just dirt, a valueless commodity that offered no dividends. But to me, it was a medium of rebellion and a vessel for the truths I wasn't allowed to speak at the dinner table. Our dinners were silent affairs, held at a dining table carved from a single slab of dark walnut that could seat 20 but usually only held the 4 of us, including my mother, who hovered like a ghost at the periphery of her own life. My father would sit at the head of the table, his posture perfect, his eyes scanning us like he was reviewing a quarterly report. He would ask Harrison about his latest acquisitions or the political climate of the firm, and Harrison would respond with practiced jargon that meant absolutely nothing but sounded expensive. When his gaze finally landed on me, it was always with a sigh of disappointment that seemed to deflate the very air in the room. He would look at my hands, even after I had scrubbed them until they were red, and he would spot a tiny speck of clay beneath a cuticle or a faint smudge of charcoal on my wrist. To him, those marks were evidence of a life being wasted, a betrayal of the Davenport pedigree that demanded perfection and profit above all else. He once told me, while cutting into a dry-aged Wagyu steak that cost $80 a pound, that I was choosing a path of voluntary poverty and that he would not be the one to subsidize my delusions once I turned 18. He kept that promise with a cold, mathematical precision that only a man of his profession could muster. The basement, which had been my sanctuary, became a battlefield where my father would occasionally descend to remind me of the market value of the square footage I was occupying with my nonsense. He would walk through my workspace in his $1,000 Italian leather loafers, looking at my half-finished busts and anatomical sketches as if they were trash waiting to be hauled away to the Greenwich transfer station. He didn't see the structural integrity of a well-executed armature or the emotional depth in the tilt of a clay chin. He only saw the lack of a price tag. He would mock the cost of my supplies, calculating how many shares of a blue-chip stock I could have bought with the money I spent on casting plaster and sculpting tools. It was a constant psychological siege, an attempt to make me feel small by using the only yardstick he knew, the dollar. Harrison was even worse, fueled by a deep-seated insecurity that he masked with cruelty. He would bring his friends from the city back to the estate for the weekend, and they would stand at the top of the basement stairs, laughing at the artist-in-residence as if I were a curiosity in a sideshow. He would brag about the commissions he was making at the firm while making sure to mention how much he had invested in his latest designer suit, all while I sat below them, covered in dust, working on a series of figures that represented the very walls of the house that was suffocating me. He once threw a glass of expensive champagne down the stairs, watching as it shattered near my feet, and told me that the shards were the only thing I'd ever have that was worth more than $10. He didn't realize that I was taking notes, that every insult and every cold shoulder was being processed and transformed into the jagged, powerful lines of my work. They were providing the fuel for the very fire they were trying to extinguish. The contrast between our lives was starkest during the holidays, when the Greenwich estate was decorated by a professional team for $15,000, turning the house into a glittering winter wonderland that felt as hollow as a plastic ornament. While Harrison was receiving bespoke watches and memberships to exclusive clubs as gifts, I was being given books on accounting and wealth management, my father's unsubtle way of telling me that it wasn't too late to fix myself. I would open those books and feel a wave of nausea, the sterile numbers on the pages feeling like a death sentence for my soul. I remember one specific Christmas where the tension finally snapped. We were sitting in the living room by a fireplace that burned gas-fed ceramic logs because real wood was too messy for my mother's rugs. My father announced that he was officially transferring my college fund into a high-yield brokerage account for Harrison's future ventures, stating that he refused to throw good money after bad. He looked at me with a terrifyingly calm expression and said that if I wanted to be an artist, I could start by figuring out the art of survival. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply went back down to the basement, packed my clay, my tools, and the few clothes I owned that weren't bought at a boutique in town. I looked at the gray grit under my fingernails and realized it was the only thing in that house that was actually mine. I had spent 18 years being treated like a liability, a rounding error in a grand financial scheme, but as I walked out of that 12,000-square-foot branding exercise into the cold Connecticut night, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that no amount of Davenport gold could ever buy back. I was leaving behind the mahogany and the marble for a life of uncertainty and struggle, but I was also leaving behind the lies. My father and Harrison thought they were liquidating a failure, but they were actually releasing a force they couldn't begin to understand. They measured the world in what they could take from it, while I was learning how to give it something it had never seen before. That night, as the iron gates of the estate clicked shut behind me, I knew that the glitch in their spreadsheet was about to become the very thing that would eventually bring their entire calculated world crashing down around them. My name is Amelia Harlow, and while they were busy counting their basis points, I was busy learning how to carve my own destiny out of the stone they thought was worthless. The betrayal that finally severed my ties to the Davenport bloodline happened on a Tuesday in late April at exactly 6:14 p.m., a moment frozen in my memory like a fly trapped in amber. I had just returned to the Greenwich estate, my heart pounding against my ribs with a frantic, hopeful rhythm because I was carrying an oversized white envelope embossed with the prestigious crest of the Rhode Island School of Design. Inside that envelope was a letter granting me a full-ride scholarship, a merit-based award with a total value of $260,000 covering tuition, studio fees, and housing for 4 years. In my 18-year-old naivety, I actually believed that this was the language my father, Charles, would finally understand. I thought that by presenting him with a clear return on investment, a $250,000 validation of my talent that cost him absolutely nothing, I could finally earn a seat at his table of respected assets. I found him in the mahogany-paneled study, the air thick with the scent of expensive cigar smoke and the faint ozone hum of his 3-monitor Bloomberg terminal setup. He was reviewing a series of offshore tax equity structures, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screens, looking every bit the senior wealth manager who dictated the financial destinies of men far more powerful than himself. When I placed the scholarship letter on his desk, right over a spread of quarterly earnings reports, I didn't say a word. I just waited for him to see my ROI, to see that I had secured my own future without depleting a single cent of the Davenport Trust. Charles didn't congratulate me, nor did he look impressed. Instead, he let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like gravel grinding together in a silk pouch. He didn't even pick up the letter to read the details of the fellowship. He simply leaned back in his $5,000 ergonomic leather chair, adjusted the silver cufflinks on his bespoke Brooks Brothers shirt, and told me with a terrifyingly calm voice that I was being delusional. He informed me that he had already taken the liberty of paying a non-refundable $5,000 enrollment deposit for a business administration degree at Cornell University, his alma mater, and that my schedule for the fall semester had already been vetted by his personal associates. He spoke about my life as if it were a mid-cap company he was restructuring, explaining that an art degree from RISD was a depreciating asset with no terminal value. When I finally found my voice and whispered the word no, the atmosphere in the room shifted from cold to lethal. Charles didn't scream, because screaming was for people who lacked the power to destroy you with a gesture. He stood up slowly, his 6'2" frame casting a long, jagged shadow across the Persian rug that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. He walked over to the corner of the study where I kept my most prized possession, a life-sized, hyper-realistic bust of my late mother, Maria, which I had spent 14 months perfecting in the damp basement. It was carved from high-density, water-based clay, capturing the exact curve of her jaw and the specific, tired kindness in her eyes that Charles had spent years trying to forget. He looked at the sculpture for a moment, his hand hovering over the delicate clay shoulder, and then he looked at me with eyes that were as vacant as an empty vault. With a casual, effortless shove, he pushed the heavy pedestal. The sound of that clay hitting the Italian marble flooring was not just a crash. It was the visceral, wet thud of my mother's memory being desecrated, followed by the sharp, crystalline ring of $4,000 worth of stone flooring cracking under the impact. That sound was the literal noise of our bloodline snapping in two, a violent punctuation mark at the end of my life as a Davenport daughter. While I stood there, paralyzed by the sight of my mother's face, shattered into 1,000 gray shards at my father's feet. My brother Harrison was standing by the $3,000 floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the manicured south lawn. He didn't offer a word of comfort or even a look of fraternal concern. Instead, he stayed focused on the glowing screen of his smartphone, smirking as he checked his real-time stock portfolio, his thumb casually scrolling through a sea of green numbers as if the destruction of my soul was merely background noise to a profitable trading day. He was already a ghost of our father, a man who had traded his empathy for an $85,000 credit limit and the approval of a man who broke things just to prove he owned them. Harrison's silence was a secondary betrayal, a confirmation that in this house you were either the hammer or the glass, and he had long ago decided which one he wanted to be. The luxury of the room felt suffocating, the gold-leafed frames and the antique books suddenly looking like the bars of a very expensive cage. I didn't stay to watch them clean up the debris of my mother's likeness. I didn't wait for the inevitable lecture on obedience or the detailed breakdown of why Cornell was the only logical choice for a girl with my last name. I waited until the house fell into its nightly, heavy silence, a silence maintained by a security system that cost $40,000 a year to ensure that nothing from the outside world could disturb the Davenports' peace. At exactly 2 a.m., while the moon hung low over the Connecticut coastline and the automatic sprinklers began their rhythmic hiss across the lawn, I zipped up a weathered nylon duffel bag. Inside, I had packed 3 changes of clothes, my most durable sculpting tools, a small bag of finishing sandpaper, and exactly $842, the entirety of the secret cash I had saved from selling small clay figurines to classmates and local boutiques over the last 3 years. I left my designer coats, my pearls, and the heavy weight of expectations in the walk-in closet that was larger than the apartment I would soon occupy. As I let myself out through the service entrance, avoiding the motion sensors I had memorized since I was 10, the air felt sharply cold, smelling of salt spray from the Long Island Sound and the damp earth of the gardens. I walked down the long, winding driveway of the 12,000-square-foot branding exercise my father called a home, my boots crunching on the gravel that was raked into perfect patterns every Tuesday morning. When I reached the iron gates, I didn't look back at the limestone facade or the flickering lights of the security cameras. I walked toward the train station in the dark, my fingers cramped around the handle of the duffel bag, feeling the grit of the basement clay still embedded deep under my fingernails. That grit was the only dowry I was taking with me. I was 18 years old, technically homeless and completely disowned, but for the first time in my existence, my breathing felt deep and unobstructed. By the time the first light of dawn began to gray the horizon over the Bronx, I was sitting on a plastic seat in a subway car heading toward a future that had no room for Charles Davenport's approval. I looked at my reflection in the dark window of the train, seeing a woman whose face was smudged with the dust of her own destruction, and I realized that I needed to shed more than just my address. I needed to shed the skin of the girl who cared about basis points and Brooks Brothers suits. I opened my notebook and scratched out the name Amelia Davenport, pressing the pencil so hard the lead snapped against the paper. I wrote a new name, a name that didn't belong to a real estate empire or a wealth management firm. I became Amelia Harlow, a name taken from the raw, hard-won resilience of the materials I worked with. I was no longer a liability to be liquidated or a glitch in a spreadsheet. I was a woman who had survived the shattering of her world and was now ready to build a new one out of the pieces. The transition was not immediate or easy, but the memory of that Tuesday at 6:14 p.m. served as a permanent battery, providing a surge of spite-fueled energy every time my hands grew too tired to hold a chisel. I spent the next decade in the shadows of the city, working in that drafty Bushwick studio where the radiator clanked like a dying machine, and the walls were thin enough to hear the heartbeat of the person in the next unit. I lived on coffee that cost 99 cents and the burning desire to see my father's face when he realized that the asset he liquidated had grown into something he could never afford to buy. My father and Harrison continued their lives in the Greenwich Mausoleum, surrounded by their marble and their mahogany, convinced that they had successfully pruned a dead branch from the family tree. They didn't realize that I wasn't a branch. I was the root. And while they were busy maintaining the branding exercise of their lives, I was deep underground, growing stronger in the dark, preparing for the moment I would finally step back into the light of the Pierre Hotel ballroom and show them exactly what a liquidated liability looks like when it becomes a masterpiece. Family is not the name on the front of a building or the balance in a brokerage account. Family is the person who refuses to break when the hammer falls. And as I watched the sunrise over the Brooklyn Bridge, I knew that I was the only Davenport who truly knew the value of what was lost that night in the study. I was Amelia Harlow, and the world was about to learn my name. I spent my first winter away from the manicured lawns of Greenwich in a 450-square-foot illegal sublet in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, a space that smelled perpetually of damp sheetrock, old cigarettes, and the metallic tang of the nearby industrial yards. The radiator was a rusted iron corpse that hissed but offered no heat, and the single-pane windows were so poorly fitted that a layer of frost would form on the inside of the glass by midnight, mirroring the ice that was beginning to settle around my heart. I slept in a $120 North Face parka I had found at a second-hand shop, shivering under a mountain of cheap fleece blankets as the wind off the East River rattled the door in its frame. My life had been reduced to the barest essentials of survival, a stark contrast to the 12,000-square-foot branding exercise I had left behind, where the floor heating was kept at a constant 72 degrees regardless of the season. In those frozen hours of the early morning, when the cold became a physical weight on my chest, I didn't feel like a victim of my father's cruelty. I felt like a weapon being tempered in the dark. I spent my nights at a grease-stained diner on Manhattan Avenue at 3 a.m, the kind of place where the fluorescent lights hummed with a headache-inducing frequency and the coffee tasted like burnt dirt and desperation. I would sit in a cracked vinyl booth, the stuffing poking through the tape, and draw on paper napkins with a stolen ballpoint pen because I couldn't justify the cost of a proper sketchbook. I wasn't just drawing figures or faces anymore. I was mapping out a 15-year war against the man who had tried to liquidate me. I realized then, as I watched a tired line cook scrape the griddle, that to destroy a man like Charles Davenport, a man who worships status, pedigree, and the perceived weight of his own name, you do not use the blunt instrument of anger. Anger is loud, messy, and predictable, and Charles had spent his entire career managing loud, messy risks. To truly break him, you use a vacuum. You remove yourself so completely from his orbit that he forgets you exist, and then you build a reality so much larger than his own that his absence becomes the only thing he can see. I took the name Amelia Davenport and I erased it from my consciousness, treating it like excess clay to be scraped off a pedestal and discarded. In its place, I created Veil, a pseudonym that was both a shield and a promise of the mystery I was becoming. Living as Veil meant a life of extreme, calculated austerity, where every penny was a soldier in my private revolution. I lived on $4 bodega sandwiches, thick rolls stuffed with processed turkey and wilted lettuce that I would stretch over 2 meals so that I could save every spare dollar for the tools of my trade. While Harrison was likely spending his weekends at the Hamptons, dropping $500 on a single dinner at Nick and Tony's, I was scouring Craigslist for used $800 welding rigs and industrial-grade angle grinders. I remember the day I finally bought my first Lincoln electric welder. It felt more significant than any birthday present I had ever received in Greenwich. I hauled that heavy, greasy machine up 3 flights of stairs, my muscles screaming and my breath hitching in the cold air, and I set it up in the corner of my sublet next to my mattress. The blue spark of the arc welder became my North Star, a searing, brilliant light that promised a future Charles could never calculate. I was building an empire in the shadows, brick by brick and weld by weld, fueled by the knowledge that men like my father eventually run out of other people's money and the luck that comes with a prestigious last name. I knew the trajectory of a man like Charles Davenport better than he knew himself. He lived on the momentum of his reputation, a house of cards built on high-yield debt and the belief that the world would always provide a safety net for a senior wealth manager of his standing. But markets shift, interest rates rise, and the arrogance that served him in his 40s would eventually become his downfall in his 60s. I anticipated the day he would come looking for a miracle, a centerpiece for a failing development project or a tax-deductible donation to save his crumbling social standing. I worked until my hands were permanently stained with graphite and iron filings, my skin toughened by burns and the constant grit of the studio. I moved from that illegal sublet to a shared warehouse space and then to a studio of my own, always keeping the name Vale as a barrier between my success and the man who had branded me a liability. My sculptures grew in scale and intensity, moving from the soft clay of my youth to the unforgiving resistance of steel and stone, reflecting the hardness I had cultivated within myself. The physical toll was immense, but it was a price I paid gladly for the autonomy it bought me. During the hottest weeks of the summer, my studio felt like an oven, the air thick with the smell of scorched metal and the fine white dust of pulverized marble that coated every surface like a layer of fresh snow. I would work 12-hour shifts at the gallery and then spend another 8 hours at my workbench, my body vibrating with the aftershocks of the pneumatic hammer. There were moments of profound loneliness, nights when the silence of the city felt like a verdict. But then I would remember the sound of that clay bust shattering on the marble floor in Greenwich. I would remember Harrison's smirk as he checked his stock portfolio while my world ended. Those memories were better than any luxury. They were a clean, cold fuel that burned without leaving ash. I was no longer the daughter who was liquidated. I was the architect of my own identity, a woman who had learned how to turn the vacuum of her father's rejection into a space where a masterpiece could finally breathe. I tracked the Davenport name from a distance, watching their public triumphs and private failures through the lens of the financial news. I saw when they lost the bid for the Hudson Yards expansion, and I noticed when Harrison's name stopped appearing in the society pages after a particularly messy legal settlement involving his firm's handling of client funds. The cracks were beginning to show in the limestone facade, just as I had predicted. They were still flying private and dining at the Pierre, but the foundation was rotting, and the creditors were starting to circle like sharks in the dark water. Meanwhile, Vale was becoming a whisper in the ears of the world's most elite collectors. My work was being sought after not because of who my father was, but because of the raw, undeniable power of what I had created in the cold. I was the miracle they didn't know they were going to need, a ghost that was slowly taking on solid, indestructible form. Every time I looked at my reflection in the polished surface of a finished steel piece, I saw a stranger. The girl who had left Greenwich with $842 in a duffel bag was gone, replaced by someone with a steady hand and a clear, unwavering vision. I had learned that true power isn't found in a Brooks Brothers suit or a high-interest black card. It's found in the ability to endure the winter and come out stronger on the other side. Charles had tried to erase me, but in doing so, he gave me the greatest gift a creator can receive, the necessity of self-invention. I sat in my studio, surrounded by the towering structures of my own making, and I knew that the 15-year war was entering its final phase. The vacuum I had created was finally starting to pull him in, and when the truth eventually came out, he would realize that the asset he liquidated was the only thing capable of saving him, and that I had no intention of being sold back to him at any price. The transition from Amelia to Vale was complete when I landed my first solo show at a major gallery in Chelsea. The curator didn't ask about my father. She asked about the tension in my lines and the emotional resonance of my materials. I stood in the center of that white-walled room, smelling the faint scent of expensive paint and wine, and I felt a profound sense of justice. I was the glitch that had become the system. I had built a legacy out of the grit under my fingernails and the $4 sandwiches, a legacy that was entirely mine, unencumbered by the debt or the lies of the Davenport brand. Charles was still sitting at table 1, still sipping his Macallan and playing the role of the king, but I was the one who held the hammer now. I had spent 15 years preparing for the strike, and as the clock ticked toward the final auction, I knew that the sound of his empire breaking would be far more satisfying than the sound of that clay bust hitting the floor. I was Amelia Harlow, the woman they called Vale, and I was finally ready to let the world see what happens when a liability decides to settle the score. By the time I reached my 30th birthday, the metamorphosis from a disowned liability into a global artistic powerhouse was complete, and my sculptures were selling for a minimum of $250,000 apiece through my gallery director, Sloane, a woman whose professional ruthlessness was matched only by her impeccable taste in mid-century modern furniture and vintage Chanel suits. Sloane was the only person who truly knew the face behind the moniker Vale, and she guarded that secret with the ferocity of a high-stakes litigator because she understood that in the world of high-end art, mystery is a commodity that appreciates even faster than talent itself. To ensure that my identity remained buried under 7 impenetrable layers of Delaware LLCs and offshore trusts, I hired a legal team from one of the most prestigious top-tier firms on Madison Avenue, a group of $650 an hour sharks who specialized in the kind of corporate invisibility that usually only protects arms dealers or tech moguls. These attorneys, men and women who wore $4,000 watches and spoke in the measured, clinical tones of executioners, constructed a legal fortress around me that ensured not a single tax filing, gallery contract, or property deed could ever be traced back to the name Amelia Davenport, or the 18-year-old girl who had walked out of a Greenwich estate with $842 in a nylon duffel bag. While I was insulating myself within this meticulously crafted anonymity, I had my own anonymous scouts and financial investigators quietly tracking the slow-motion car crash that was the Davenport legacy, watching from the shadows as the empire Charles had built on the backs of other people's labor began to succumb to the rot of his own arrogance. I watched their bank statements via public filings and strategic industry leaks that Sloane's connections provided, seeing the cold, hard numbers that confirmed what I had sensed a decade ago. Charles was desperate and losing his grip on the very world he claimed to master. He had lost 40% of his client book in a single fiscal year as the old money families of Manhattan began to realize that his aggressive, high-risk strategies were better suited for a casino than a legacy trust, and his reputation as a senior wealth manager was evaporating faster than the condensation on a glass of expensive scotch. The Davenport Holdings headquarters, once a bustling hub of financial dominance on Park Avenue, had become a quiet, echoing tomb, where the only things still growing were the interest rates on his mounting commercial debts and the resentment in his eyes. Harrison, my dear brother who had spent 35 years playing the role of the golden heir, was arguably in a worse position than our father because he lacked even the basic survival instincts that Charles had used to claw his way to the top in the first place. Harrison had mortgaged the 12,000-square-foot Greenwich estate for the 3rd time in 5 years, a desperate financial maneuver intended to liquidize whatever equity remained in the limestone walls to pay for his wife's $60,000 charity galas and a lifestyle that was increasingly held together by the thin thread of high-interest credit cards. He was still wearing $14,000 watches and driving a custom-ordered black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country that cost $95,000. But the title was likely held by a predatory lender, and the gas tank was probably filled with the last few dollars of a rapidly depleting checking account. They were drowning in a sea of their own making, struggling to maintain the branding exercise of their lives while the water rose above their Brooks Brothers lapels, and the irony of their situation was a bitter, satisfying nectar that fueled my long nights in the studio. The most delicious twist in this 15-year war of attrition was the fact that their only potential lifesaver, the man they believed could provide the influx of capital necessary to save Davenport Holdings from total liquidation, was a tech billionaire named Julian Sterling. Julian was a 40-year-old visionary who had made his fortune in decentralized finance and green energy. a man who possessed the kind of authentic, liquid wealth that my father could only dream of managing, and he also happened to be my biggest and most dedicated art collector. Julian owned 5 of my major pieces, including a 3-ton granite and steel installation that stood in the foyer of his Palo Alto estate, and he had spent the last 3 years obsessively tracking every new release from the artist known as Vale. Charles and Harrison were currently courting Julian with the desperation of starving dogs, trying to convince him to anchor their new development project with a $200 million investment, completely unaware that the woman whose work Julian worshipped was the same liability they had tossed out into the cold on a rainy Tuesday in April. I spent my days in a sprawling 10,000-square-foot studio in Long Island City, a space that was part laboratory and part cathedral, where the air was always thick with the scent of ozone from the welding rigs and the fine white powder of pulverized marble that cost $1,200 a slab. I moved through the space with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone but herself, my hands constantly busy with the pneumatic hammers and diamond-tipped saws that were the instruments of my triumph. I wasn't just creating art anymore. I was creating the ultimate mirror for my father's failure, a physical manifestation of everything he told me I could never be. Sloane would visit me once a week, stepping over the piles of industrial scrap in her designer heels to show me the latest auction results or the invitations to international biennials that I would inevitably decline. She understood that my power came from my absence, from the fact that the more the world clamored to see the face of Vale, the more I retreated into the work itself. I remember standing in front of my latest piece, a jagged, 6-foot-tall structure of obsidian and shattered glass titled The Cost of Silence, while reading a leaked internal memo from Davenport Holdings that detailed their plan to use the acquisition of a Vale sculpture as a centerpiece for their investor pitch to Julian Sterling. They thought that by appearing to be patrons of the world's most sought-after contemporary artist, they could manufacture the illusion of cultural relevance and financial stability. They were planning to spend $1.5 million, money they essentially didn't have, on a single work of mine at the Pierre Hotel auction just to impress a man who already considered me a genius. The circularity of the betrayal was perfect. I was going to use my father's own vanity to drain the last of his resources, forcing him to pay a premium for the very talent he had tried to extinguish. Every 60-centimeter cut I made into the obsidian felt like a surgical strike against the memory of that Tuesday evening at 6:14 p.m. when he pushed my mother's bust off the console table. The financial investigators I employed, true professionals who charged $3,000 a month just for the subscription to their proprietary data feeds, provided me with a daily briefing on the Davenport's liquidity crisis. I knew that Charles had been forced to sell his share in the private jet consortium and that Harrison had recently been denied an increase on his signature line of credit at Deutsche Bank. They were living on borrowed time and the lingering fumes of a prestigious reputation, while I was sitting on a mountain of cash and a portfolio of real estate that was entirely unencumbered by debt. I lived in a minimalist penthouse in Tribeca that cost $12 million, paid for in a single wire transfer from a shell company, a space characterized by floor-to-ceiling glass and a view of the city that made the Greenwich estate look like a dollhouse. Yet, despite the luxury, I still slept in that old North Face parka, on the nights when the air conditioning felt too much like the silence of my youth, a reminder of the winter in Greenpoint that had forged me into the woman I was today. I watched through the digital eyes of my security system as Julian Sterling's assistant sent a formal inquiry to Sloane regarding the availability of any new large-scale commissions, mentioning that Julian was planning a major gala at the Pierre Hotel to announce a new partnership. The trap was being set with a precision that would have made my father proud if he weren't the intended target. Sloane and I coordinated the release of the liquidated assets specifically for this auction, ensuring that the marketing materials reached the desks of every major developer in the city, knowing that Charles would see it as his last chance to secure Julian's favor. We made sure the starting bid was high enough to hurt, but low enough to entice a man who was used to winning at any cost. I wasn't motivated by a simple desire for money. I had more than I could ever spend. I was motivated by the desire to see the moment of realization, the exact millisecond when the branding exercise of the Davenport life met the reality of the Harlow legacy. As the date of the auction approached, I felt a calm, cold clarity settle over me, the same feeling I got just before the final strike of a chisel that would finish a piece. I spent hours in my studio, not working, but just sitting in the dark, listening to the hum of the city and the distant sirens, thinking about the 18-year-old girl who had been told she was a liability. I thought about the $4 sandwiches and the dead radiators, and I realized that those things hadn't been hardships. They had been the raw materials of my greatest work. My father had tried to liquidate me because he couldn't control the value I represented. But in doing so, he had inadvertently freed me from the constraints of his own small, calculated world. Now, the vacuum I had created was finally ready to be filled with the sound of his falling empire. I was 30 years old, a world-renowned sculptor, a multimillionaire shrouded in mystery, and the architect of a vengeance that was as beautiful and enduring as the marble I carved. The stage was set, the sharks were fed, and Julian Sterling was arriving in New York with a checkbook and a taste for modern form. The Davenports were drowning, and they were about to find out that the lifesaver they were reaching for was made of solid, unforgiving stone. The trap was set within the gilded confines of the Pierre Hotel Grand Ballroom, a space that breathed an atmosphere of forced opulence and high-stakes desperation, where 500 of Manhattan's most influential power brokers sat before $1,200-a-plate dinners of seared wagyu and truffle-infused reduction. The air was a cloying mixture of expensive Casablanca lilies, vintage Chanel No. 5, and the sharp, metallic tang of anxiety that emanated from the men in the room who knew their empires were built on shifting sand. My father, Charles Davenport, sat at table 1, appearing to the casual observer as the quintessential senior wealth manager in his $4,000 bespoke tuxedo. Yet to my trained eye, he was a man unraveling at the seams as he leaned in to whisper into the ear of Julian Sterling, the tech billionaire whose $500 million account represented the final life raft for Davenport Holdings. Charles had spent the last hour spinning a web of intricate lies, claiming with a practiced, predatory confidence that his firm not only represented the anonymous artist known as Vale, but effectively managed the artist's entire private estate and future commission schedule. He was selling a ghost, promising Julian a personal introduction to the most sought-after recluse in the art world as the ultimate closing gift for a deal that would theoretically save him from the looming specter of total liquidation and public disgrace. As the waitstaff moved with choreographed precision between the tables, clearing the appetizer plates and pouring refills of a $2,200-a-bottle Krug champagne, I could see the fine sheen of sweat breaking out on my father's forehead, a moisture that no amount of industrial-strength air conditioning could suppress. His slate-gray eyes darted frantically toward the ballroom entrance every time the heavy oak doors creaked open, his pulse likely hammering against the starch of his Brooks Brothers collar as he waited for a signal from the private investigators he had hired. Charles had authorized $25,000 in emergency retainers to a top-tier security firm on Lexington Avenue, tasking them with the impossible mission of identifying and locating Vale before the dessert course was served, desperate to find a body he could present to Julian Sterling to validate his fraudulent claims. He was a man who had spent 61 years believing that every person had a price and every secret could be bought if the wire transfer was large enough, yet he was currently being haunted by a vacuum of his own making, a silence that all his managed wealth could not penetrate. He had no idea that the artist he was hunting with such predatory fervor was already in the room, perched high above the sea of black ties and silk gowns in a $5,000 a night private opera box that offered a panoramic view of his impending downfall. I sat in the shadows of the velvet curtains, draped in a custom-tailored black silk gown that felt like a second skin, watching my father and brother through a pair of vintage brass opera glasses as if they were specimens in a dying ecosystem. Beside me, Sloane sat with a tablet in her lap, her eyes fixed on the real-time bidding software that would soon determine the fate of the liquidated asset, the sculpture that was currently draped in a heavy black shroud on the stage below. From this vantage point, the Davenports looked small, their movements jittery and uncoordinated compared to the calm, steady rhythm of the room, and I felt a profound sense of detachment as I watched Harrison check his watch for the 10th time in 5 minutes. Harrison was wearing the $14,000 Rolex that was likely his last remaining asset of value, his jaw tight as he tried to mimic our father's mask of composure, unaware that the $85,000 balance on his high-interest black card was about to become the least of his financial concerns. The scent of the lilies seemed to grow stronger as the house lights dimmed, signaling the start of the live auction and the moment when the branding exercise of the Davenport name would finally collide with the reality of the Harlow legacy. I watched Charles adjust his silver cufflinks, a nervous habit he had developed back in 2009 when the first cracks in the real estate market began to appear, and I realized that he was no longer the terrifying giant who had shattered my mother's bust on the marble floor. He was just an aging salesman in an expensive suit, terrified of the vacuum he had created when he decided that his daughter was a liability to be liquidated. Julian Sterling sat next to him, looking bored and unimpressed by the sycophantic chatter, his eyes fixed on the stage with the intensity of a man who only cared about the purity of the form, not the pedigree of the person holding the gavel. Julian's presence was the catalyst for the entire disaster, the high-voltage current that was about to blow the fuses of the Davenport empire, and I felt a flicker of grim appreciation for the role he was unwittingly playing in my 15-year war. The auctioneer took his place behind the mahogany rostrum, his voice booming through the high-fidelity sound system of the Pierre Hotel, commanding the attention of the 500 guests who had come to witness the sale of the decade. He spoke of Vale in hushed, reverent tones, describing the artist as a visionary who captured the jagged edges of human resilience, a description that made my father nod vigorously as if he had personally coached me on the technique. Charles reached out and touched Julian's arm, a gesture of faux intimacy that made Julian stiffen, as my father likely whispered one last promise about the introduction that was never going to happen. The private investigators were nowhere to be found, their $25,000 retainer wasted on a ghost that didn't want to be caught, and I could see the muscles in my father's neck corded with tension as the shroud was finally pulled back to reveal the liquidated asset. The spotlight hit the translucent Carrara marble, making the sculpture glow from within like a trapped star, and for a moment, the entire ballroom went silent as the beauty of the work momentarily transcended the greed and desperation of the people in the room. From my opera box, I could see the exact moment the light hit my father's face, illuminating the hollows of his cheeks and the sheer terror in his eyes as he stared at the piece he had committed to buying with money he didn't have. He was caught in a trap of his own vanity, forced to bid on a masterpiece to prove he was the patron he claimed to be, knowing that if he failed to secure the work, Julian Sterling would walk away from the $500 million account before the coffee was even served. The bidding started at $500,000, a number that would have seemed astronomical to the girl who lived on $4 bodega sandwiches in Greenpoint, but in this room, it was merely the opening ante in a game of professional survival. I watched my father's hand tremble as he raised his paddle for the first time, his movements sluggish as if the tuxedo he wore had suddenly become a suit of lead. He was bidding against the Chicago developer, against the anonymous phone lines, and ultimately against the very daughter he had erased from his ledger 15 years ago. The auctioneer's voice rose in pitch and tempo as the numbers climbed past 800,000, then 1 million, and finally reached the 1.2 million mark, where most of the room began to drop out, leaving only the truly desperate and the truly wealthy in the fray. Charles was sweating profusely now, the salt of his anxiety stinging his eyes as he looked over at Julian, seeking some sign of approval or encouragement that would justify the financial suicide he was about to commit. Julian remained impassive, his focus entirely on the marble figure emerging from the stone, a figure that represented the very resilience my father had tried to crush. Every time my father raised his paddle, he was signing away another piece of his crumbling foundation, mortgaging a future that was already in default, driven by the delusional belief that he could buy back the respect he had squandered. He was a man worshipping at the altar of status, unaware that the deity he was praying to had already abandoned him in favor of the girl in the shadows. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the cold brass rail of the opera box, feeling the vibration of the room as the bidding reached $1.4 million and the tension became almost physical, a pressurized weight that seemed to distort the very air of the Pierre Hotel. I saw Harrison whisper something to our father, his face pale and drawn, likely a warning about the liquidity limits of their remaining accounts, but Charles brushed him off with a violent, dismissive wave of his hand. He was all in, a gambler chasing a loss with the last of his chips, convinced that the introduction to Vale would fix everything, that the miracle would manifest if he just spent enough of other people's money. He didn't realize that the vacuum was closing in, that the silence he had imposed on me for 15 years was about to be broken by the strike of a hammer that would echo through the canyons of Manhattan real estate for decades to come. The auctioneer paused at $1.5 million, his eyes scanning the room for one final challenger, the silence in the ballroom so profound that I could hear the faint hum of the electronic bid board as it updated the currency conversions. Charles sat frozen, his paddle held aloft like a white flag of surrender, disguised as a gesture of dominance, his heart likely thudding against his ribs with the rhythm of a funeral drum. He had won the piece, but in doing so he had effectively liquidated himself, spending the last of his credibility and his cash on a work of art created by the liability he had once pushed out of a townhouse foyer. I watched him exhale a long, shaky breath as the gavel finally fell, the sound of the hammer strike echoing like a gunshot in the plush surroundings of the ballroom. He stood up, a ghost of a smile on his face as he turned to Julian Sterling, ready to claim his prize and deliver the introduction he had promised, completely unaware that the artist was watching him from $5,000 worth of velvet and shadow, preparing to step into the light and finish the war he had started on a Tuesday at 6:14 p.m. Family isn't a branding exercise or a managed portfolio. Family is the one who survives the liquidation, and as I stood up to leave the opera box, I knew that the Davenports were about to find out exactly what happens when the past you tried to bury decides to collect its debt in full. The atmosphere in the Pierre Hotel Grand Ballroom reached a fever pitch as the house lights dimmed further, leaving only a singular, blindingly white spotlight focused on the masterpiece of the evening, while the auctioneer, a man whose voice possessed the practiced gravitas of a high court judge, cleared his throat into the golden microphone to announce Lot 14, a work titled The Weight of Expectations by the artist known only as Vale. The bidding started at a staggering $200,000, a number that sent a collective ripple of hushed excitement through the 500 gathered guests who were well aware that this single transaction would likely define the contemporary art market for the next fiscal year. Paddles flew into the air with a frantic, rhythmic intensity, representing the hidden fortunes of tech moguls, real estate titans, and European aristocrats. But my eyes were fixed solely on Table 1, where my father, Charles Davenport, sat like a king about to receive his crown. When Julian Sterling, the billionaire whose $500 million account was the holy grail of Charles's failing career, finally shouted $1.5 million with a definitive, bone-deep authority, the room erupted in a brief, stunned silence before a wave of polite applause broke out. Charles beamed with a predatory, triumphant radiance, leaning over to pat the billionaire's shoulder with a proprietary familiarity, as if he personally owned the hands that had carved the marble, looking every bit the senior wealth manager who had successfully brokered the ultimate deal of his life. Then, with a sudden, choreographed precision that signaled the true climax of the evening, the spotlight shifted away from the sculpture and moved with a sweeping, dramatic grace toward the grand marble staircase that flanked the ballroom's western wing. I stepped out from the shadows of the mezzanine, my silhouette framed by the gilded architecture of the Pierre, wearing a midnight blue silk gown that flowed around my ankles like a river of deep-sea ink, the fabric shimmering under the high-intensity theater lights. As I began my descent, the only remnants of my former life, a pair of $12,000 diamond studs that I had taken from the Davenport safe on the night I was liquidated 15 years ago, caught the light, flashing with a cold, brilliant defiance that seemed to blind the front row of the audience. Every eye in the room, including the terrified, recognition-dawning eyes of my father and the wide, shocked gaze of my brother Harrison, followed my steady, unhurried progress down those marble steps, the sound of my heels clicking against the stone like the rhythmic ticking of a countdown. I moved past the towers of white lilies and the shivering socialites, my posture reflecting the decade and a half I had spent wrestling with steel and granite, until I reached the stage where the auctioneer stood frozen in mid-sentence. I took the microphone from his trembling hand, the cold metal feeling familiar and solid in my grip, and I looked out at the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns through the $50,000 state-of-the-art sound system that ensured every syllable would resonate in the farthest corners of the hall. "My name is Amelia Harlow," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the tremors that had once characterized my speech in the Greenwich estate, and I watched as the color drained from my father's face, leaving him looking like a crumbling limestone statue in his $4,000 tuxedo. "But you know me as Vale," I continued, the revelation hitting the room like a physical shockwave that caused several people in the front rows to gasp audibly while the photographers from the major art journals began a frantic strobe light assault with their cameras. I allowed the silence to hang in the air for a moment, letting the weight of the truth settle over the ballroom like a heavy velvet shroud, before I turned my gaze directly toward Table 1, where Charles Davenport sat paralyzed by the sudden, violent collapse of his carefully constructed branding exercise. And I have never met this man, Charles Davenport, in a professional capacity in my life, I declared, the words echoing with a crystalline clarity that effectively severed the last thread of his credibility in front of the very billionaire he had tried to deceive. The silence that followed was not the polite silence of a gala, but the suffocating, airless vacuum of a social execution, as the elite of Manhattan realized they were witnessing the total liquidation of a man's reputation in real time. Charles's hand, which had been resting so confidently on Julian Sterling's shoulder just moments before, now hung limp and useless as Julian slowly turned his head to look at the man who had just been exposed as a fraudulent ghost peddler. The $85,000 debt on Harrison's black card and the third mortgage on the 12,000-square-foot Greenwich estate were suddenly the least of their worries, as the primary asset they had tried to leverage. Their name and the lie of their influence evaporated under the glare of the ballroom lights. I stood on that stage not as a daughter seeking a reconciliation that was never earned, but as an artist who had built a kingdom out of the grit under her fingernails and the $4 bodega sandwiches of her youth. I was the liability that had grown into a power they couldn't calculate, a woman who had spent 15 years tempering her soul in the cold of Brooklyn to ensure that when the hammer finally fell, it would be my hand holding the handle. My father's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for oxygen in a drying pond. But no sound came out, his senior wealth manager training failing him completely in the face of a variable he had long ago written off as a rounding error. He looked older than his 61 years, the seams of his Brooks Brothers suit suddenly looking fragile against the immense, undeniable presence of the woman standing on the stage. Julian Sterling stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving mine, a look of profound intellectual respect replacing the boredom he had displayed all evening, as he realized that the masterpiece he had just purchased for $1.5 million was the work of the woman he had been told was a mere administrative ward of the Davenport firm. The betrayal was complete, the trap was sprung, and the Pierre Hotel Grand Ballroom had become the site of a reckoning that no amount of offshore tax equity or diversified portfolios could mitigate. Family isn't the blood that is shared in a limestone mansion or the names printed on a museum plaque. Family is the truth that survives when the lights are at their brightest and the masks are finally removed. As I stood there in the midnight blue gown looking down at the man who had pushed my mother's bust off a mahogany table, I knew that the 15-year war was over, and the only thing left of the Davenport empire was the dust I was about to sweep off my shoes. I watched the reporters from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal leaning in, their pens scratching frantically against their notebooks as they recorded the most sensational collapse in the history of the Manhattan Social Register. Charles looked at Harrison, but his son was staring at his $14,000 Rolex as if the ticking hands could somehow transport him back to a time before the spotlight shifted, his face a mask of pale, aristocratic terror. The vacuum I had created in Greenpoint had finally reached the Pierre, and it was sucking the very air out of their lungs, leaving them hollowed out and exposed for the world to see. I had waited 5,475 days for this moment, and yet I felt a strange, cold peace instead of the hot fire of revenge, a realization that my value was never theirs to decide or to liquidate. I was Amelia Harlow, the daughter who starved until she learned how to feed her own soul, and as I walked off the stage toward the waiting arms of Sloan and my legal team, I didn't look back at the man in the charcoal tuxedo. I was moving toward a future where my name was no longer a liability, but a permanent, indelible mark on the stone of the world, a masterpiece carved from the very rejection that was supposed to destroy me. The weight of expectations had finally been transferred from my shoulders to theirs, and as I heard the first murmurs of the crowd turning into a roar of conversation, I knew that tomorrow morning's headlines would be the final nail in the coffin of the Davenport branding exercise. Julian Sterling approached the stage, ignoring my father's desperate attempts to intercept him, and he simply nodded at me with a look that said he understood the cost of every chisel mark on the marble he now owned. The $1.5 million hammer strike had landed, and while it had broken my father's empire beyond repair, it had finally, irrevocably, set me free. I walked out of the ballroom and into the cool night air of Fifth Avenue, the scent of the lilies replaced by the clean, sharp smell of the city I had conquered, knowing that the little girl who slept in a North Face parka would finally be able to sleep in the warmth of her own undeniable truth. The war was won, the debt was paid, and the artist was finally, fully, alive in the light. The silence that followed my revelation was a physical entity, a deafening, pressurized vacuum that seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the Pierre Hotel's grand ballroom and leave the 500 gathered elites gasping in a collective, horrified realization. I stood on that stage, the weight of the microphone solid in my hand, and watched the color drain from my father's face in real time, his skin turning a sickly, ashen shade of gray that matched the exact hue of the wet clay bust he had shattered on our marble floor 15 years ago. Charles Davenport, the man who had built an entire persona around the calculated management of high-value assets and the ruthless liquidation of perceived liabilities, was now the most toxic asset in the room, his eyes wide and hollow as he realized that the daughter he had erased was the architect of his public execution. The elite of Manhattan, the same people who had spent decades nodding at his hollow pronouncements and drinking his expensive scotch, now looked away as if his very presence were contagious, their silence a brutal verdict on a man whose only currency had been a reputation built on a foundation of lies and unearned arrogance. Julian Sterling, the tech billionaire whose $500 million portfolio had been the singular anchor of my father's desperate hopes for a miracle, stood up from table one with a slow, deliberate grace that carried the finality of a closing bell. He didn't scream, he didn't demand an explanation, and he didn't even look back at the man who had been patting his shoulder just moments before with such proprietary confidence. He simply adjusted the sleeves of his charcoal suit and retracted his entire investment commitment on the spot with a single sharp nod to his waiting assistants. I watched as Julian walked out of the ballroom, his departure a signal for the rest of the room's power brokers to begin their own quiet, hurried exits, leaving my father and Harrison sitting alone at a table surrounded by half-eaten $1,200 dinners and the wilting scent of expensive lilies. The empire of Davenport Holdings, which had survived market crashes and legal challenges through sheer, stubborn vanity, had finally met a resistance it couldn't overcome. The undeniable truth of a woman who had learned how to turn her own rejection into an indestructible masterpiece of form and steel. By exactly 9 a.m. the next morning, the board of directors at Davenport Holdings, a group of men who measured loyalty only in terms of quarterly dividends and risk mitigation, had already convened an emergency session and officially retired my father from the firm he had spent his life branding as his own. They stripped him of his title, his corner office on Park Avenue with its view of the Chrysler Building, and the prestigious reputation that had been his only true source of nourishment, leaving him with nothing but a shrinking pension and the crushing weight of the debts Harrison had accumulated. The $3,000 floor-to-ceiling windows of the Greenwich estate now looked out over a landscape that no longer belonged to them in any meaningful way, as the third mortgage and the mounting legal fees began to pull the limestone walls down around their ears. My brother Harrison, the golden boy who had spent $14,000 on a watch to look the part while his soul was in a state of permanent overdraft, found himself facing the visceral reality of his own inadequacy just 3 days later, when his leased 2024 Lexus was repossessed from the driveway of a country club he could no longer afford to enter. I didn't stay to watch the final dismantling of their lives or the slow, agonizing process of their social liquidation, because I had already achieved the only closure that mattered, the reclamation of my own name and the absolute validation of my own worth. I returned to my 4,000-square-foot studio in Long Island City, a space that was not a branding exercise or a mausoleum of stolen memories, but a sanctuary built on my own terms with the grit of my own hands and the heat of my own fire. The air in the studio still smelled faintly of scorched metal and the fine white dust of the Carrara marble I had conquered, a scent that felt more like home than any room in the Greenwich estate ever had. I poured myself a glass of $200 Lagavulin scotch, the amber liquid catching the afternoon light as it filtered through the industrial windows, and I sat in a vintage leather chair that I had bought with my own hard-earned commissions. I enjoyed the silence of a house that wasn't haunted by the expectations of a senior wealth manager or the smug superiority of a brother who measured life in credit limits, a silence that was deep, restorative, and entirely mine. Looking at the calloused skin of my palms and the faint, permanent smudges of graphite under my fingernails, I realized that the 15-year war had not just been about destroying Charles Davenport, but about outgrowing the version of myself that had ever needed his approval. I was no longer the 18-year-old girl with $842 in a duffel bag, shivering in a North Face parka in an illegal Greenpoint sublet, but that girl was the one who had provided the structural integrity for the woman I had become. She was the one who had understood that to survive a man who worships status, you must become something that status cannot buy. An original, unrepeatable force of nature that exists outside his ability to calculate or control. I had taken the vacuum of his rejection and filled it with a legacy of stone and steel, creating a world where my value was determined by the precision of my strike and the depth of my vision, rather than the balance of a trust fund I never wanted. The $1.5 million hammer strike at the Pierre Hotel hadn't just broken his empire. It had shattered the last of the chains that tethered my identity to his failure, leaving me free to exist as Amelia Harlow, the sculptor who found her voice in the cracks of her own destruction. Family, as I had finally come to understand in the quiet of my studio, is not a biological obligation or a name etched into the Italian marble of a foyer. It is the deliberate choice to stand by someone when the truth comes out and the masks are finally removed. My father and Harrison had never been family. They were merely the inhabitants of a limestone cage who had mistaken their dominance for love and their wealth for worth. The true family I had found was in the raw materials I worked with, in the loyalty of a gallery director like Sloane who saw the woman behind the veil, and in the quiet resilience of my own spirit that refused to be liquidated. As I watched the sun set over the Manhattan skyline, casting long, jagged shadows across the sculptures that represented my journey from liability to masterpiece, I felt a sense of peace that was as solid and enduring as the granite I carved. I had survived the winter, I had won the war, and I had built a life that was as beautiful and unforgiving as the truth itself. The sound of my father's bloodline snapping had been replaced by the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of my own creation, a sound that would continue to echo long after the Davenport name had been forgotten by the history books of the city. I thought about the 12,000-square-foot branding exercise in Greenwich, now likely being inventoried by estate lawyers and creditors, and I felt nothing but a distant, clinical pity for the men who had once tried to define my existence. They were the ones who were truly poor now, not because of the lost portfolios or the repossessed cars, but because they had never learned how to create anything that could survive the silence of an empty room. I, on the other hand, was surrounded by the evidence of my own survival, by the heavy, tangible proof that a liquidated asset can become the very thing that the world eventually clamors to own. I sipped my scotch and let the warmth of it settle in my chest, knowing that tomorrow morning I would pick up my chisel and begin a new piece, one that wasn't fueled by spite or revenge, but by the sheer, unadulterated joy of being the architect of my own destiny. The weight of expectations had finally been lifted, and in its place was the lightness of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. My name is Amelia Harlow, and for 32 years, I have been carving my way out of the shadows cast by a man who thought he could buy the sun. I have learned that the most powerful thing you can do when someone tries to erase you is to write your own story in a medium that can never be wiped away. I have learned that a house built on your own terms is the only one worth living in, and that the silence of a life without toxic legacies is the most beautiful music a soul can ever hear. As the city lights began to twinkle across the river, I raised my glass to the girl in the North Face parka, the one who had the courage to walk out into the cold and the wisdom to know that the winter was only temporary. We had made it, she and I, through the grit and the hunger and the long, dark nights of the soul, and the empire we had built in the shadows was now standing tall in the light of our own undeniable truth. The war was over, the debt was settled in full, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be, holding the hammer and the heart of my own masterpiece.